If you look at Ireland today, you see a place of breathtaking beauty, a vibrant, resilient nation. But the land holds memories, deep, sorrowful memories. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of a time when this green land was the backdrop for one of the greatest tragedies of the 19th century. It all started with something small, something dependable, the potato. For millions in Ireland by the 1840s, the potato wasn't just food, it was life itself. It was cheap, nutritious, and it could grow in the poorest soils, allowing a large family to survive on just a tiny plot of land. It was the foundation of everything. But what happens when that foundation cracks? What happens when the one thing you depend on for survival simply vanishes? To understand the Great Famine, you first have to understand the Ireland of the 1840s. It was a country that, for centuries, had been under British rule. The best land was owned by a small group of wealthy, often English, landlords who rarely set foot in the country. The Irish people, particularly in the West, were tenants on their own ancestral land. They rented tiny plots, often just an acre or two, and on that they had to grow enough to feed their families and pay the rent. The potato was the only crop that could produce enough food on such a small scale. There was no room for error, no backup plan. For nearly half the population, this single crop was the only thing standing between them and utter destitution. It was a system balanced on a knife's edge. And in 1845, that knife began to fall. It came silently, carried on the wind. A fungus, Phytophthora infestans. The farmers first noticed a strange fog, a peculiar smell in the air. Then, the leaves of their potato plants began to wither. When they went to dig the harvest, their hearts sank. The potatoes they pulled from the earth were a black, foul-smelling, inedible pulp. In the morning, we were delighted to see our fields thriving, but by evening, our entire stock of food was a fetid poison. In the first year, almost half the crop was lost. People went hungry, but they held on, hoping the next year would be better. They planted what few seed potatoes they had left. But 1846 was worse. The blight returned with a vengeance, wiping out nearly the entire crop. The knife hadn't just fallen, it had shattered the foundation of Irish life. The Great Hunger and Gorta Mór had begun. Now, you might think the government of the most powerful empire in the world would rush to help its subjects. But the response from London was tragically, fatally, slow, and inadequate. It was shaped by an economic ideology called Laissez-Faire, the belief that the government should not interfere with the free market. Men like Sir Charles Trevelyan, the head of relief efforts, saw the famine not as a crisis to be solved, but as a mechanism for reducing surplus population, a way for God to punish the lazy Irish. While the people starved, Ireland continued to export enormous quantities of food. Grain, butter, livestock, all shipped out of the country to be sold in Britain and beyond, often passing carts filled with the dead and dying on their way to the ports. The government did set up some relief, public works projects, where starving men were forced to perform grueling labor for pennies, often dying from exhaustion. Later, soup kitchens were established, but they were too little, too late, and often conditional on people giving up their tiny plots of land. The result was a humanitarian catastrophe. Starvation gave way to disease. Typhus, dysentery, famine fever. They swept through the weakened population. Entire villages were wiped out. People died in their homes, on the roadsides. The social fabric unraveled. The silence of the land was broken only by the cries of the hungry and the dogs scavenging among the dead. For those who could, there was only one path left: escape. A desperate exodus began. Millions fled the country, seeking a new life in America, Canada, and Australia. The journey itself was another trial. They crammed onto vessels that were so overcrowded and disease-ridden they became known as coffin ships. Thousands died during the weeks-long voyage from starvation and sickness. They were buried at sea, their bodies cast into the cold Atlantic. One Canadian official, witnessing the arrival of these ships at Grosse Isle, a quarantine station, said, "I have seen the immigrant depot of a single ship loaded with the dead, the dying, and the diseased." Yet they kept coming. It was a choice between a probable death at home and a chance, however slim, at life elsewhere. By the time the Blight finally eased in 1852, Ireland was forever changed. Over 1 million people had died. Another 2 million had emigrated. In less than a decade, the country lost nearly a quarter of its population. The landscape was littered with ghost villages and unmarked graves. The culture was wounded too. The famine dealt a devastating blow to the Irish language, as its heartlands in the West were the hardest hit. But out of this unimaginable suffering, something else grew, a hardened resolve. The belief that the British government's response was not just a failure, but a deliberate betrayal, fueled a new, more fervent wave of Irish nationalism that would ultimately lead to the fight for independence. Today, the Great Famine is remembered. Memorials across Ireland and around the world stand as silent witnesses to the suffering. They remind us that this wasn't simply a story of a failed crop. It was a story of a vulnerable population, of political indifference, and of economic theories applied with devastating consequences. The story of Gorta Mór is a warning. It shows us how quickly civilization can recede when the systems we rely on fail. But it's also a profound story of survival. The millions who fled Ireland and their descendants built new lives, creating the global Irish diaspora we know today. They carried the memory of what they had lost, but they also carried a strength forged in the crucible of unimaginable hardship. And that resilience is the final, enduring legacy of the Great Hunger, a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of the void. A story that should never be forgotten.